I never thought I'd become famous for a dish I didn't create, but that's exactly what happened, and the journey nearly cost me everything I cared about. My name is Eliza Chen, and 5 years ago, I married into the Rossi family, a tight-knit Italian-American clan with 3 generations of history in the restaurant business. My husband Marco was the black sheep who'd walked away from the family business to become an architect, much to his father Antonio's dismay. Food is in our blood, Antonio would say whenever Marco's career came up. 27 years I spent building this restaurant, and my only son decides to draw buildings instead of making something people can actually enjoy. Despite the tension, we had family dinner at Rossi's every Sunday, a tradition Marco insisted we maintain. I'd sit there between Marco's sisters Sofia and Lucia, both of whom worked at the restaurant, trying to navigate the complex web of family dynamics while Antonio regaled everyone with stories of the early days. The restaurant was undeniably successful. Rossi's Italian bistro had been featured in food magazines and had lines out the door most weekends. The crown jewel of their menu was Nonna's secret ragu, a family recipe passed down from Marco's grandmother that customers raved about. My relationship with the family was cordial but distant until the day I made an innocent suggestion. "Have you ever thought about bottling Nonna's ragu for retail?" I asked during one Sunday dinner. People could enjoy it at home between restaurant visits. The table fell silent. Marco winced beside me. "That recipe stays in this kitchen," Antonio replied firmly. "My mother made me promise never to mass produce it. Quality can't be maintained in a factory." I nodded and dropped the subject, but the wheels were already turning in my head. I had a background in marketing before switching to freelance food photography, and I could see the untapped potential. A few weeks later, I broached the subject again, this time with a full presentation. Sales projections, marketing concepts, limited production to maintain quality control. I'd done my homework. We could start small, I explained as the family gathered in the restaurant after hours. Local gourmet shops, then regional expansion if it takes off. The recipe would remain exactly the same. Sofia seemed intrigued. Lucia was skeptical but open to discussion. Marco's mother Maria was quietly supportive, but Antonio shut it down immediately. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice hard. "You come into this family for 5 minutes and think you can change how we've done business for decades. This isn't a marketing exercise, Eliza. This is our heritage." "I'm not trying to change your heritage," I replied, stung by his dismissal. "I'm suggesting a way to share it with more people, and yes, make more money for the family in the process." Antonio stood up, towering over the table. "Money isn't everything. Loyalty is everything. Tradition is everything." He turned to Marco. "Control your wife. She doesn't understand our ways." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. Marco put his hand on mine under the table, but said nothing to defend me. The discussion was over. On the drive home, I finally broke the silence. "You just sat there while he insulted me." Marco sighed. "You don't understand how he works. Pushing only makes him more stubborn. He'll never agree to bottling Nonna's sauce." It was a good idea, I insisted. A great idea that could secure the restaurant's legacy for another generation. "Maybe," Marco conceded, "but it's not our decision to make." I let it go, outwardly at least, but I couldn't shake the conviction that the Rossi family was missing out on something transformative. 3 months later, life took an unexpected turn. Marco's firm won a major project in Singapore that required him to relocate for at least a year. The timing was terrible. I was just starting to build a steady client base for my food photography, but we agreed it was too important to pass up. "Come with me," Marco pleaded. "I can't abandon my clients," I replied. "I've worked too hard to establish myself." We compromised. I would stay behind for 6 months to fulfill my existing contracts and build a portfolio that could transfer internationally. Then I would join him in Singapore. The first month apart was difficult but manageable. I threw myself into work, taking on as many projects as possible. One of those projects was for an upscale local grocery chain launching a new artisan Italian line of products. They needed food photography and had been referred to me by a previous client. During the shoot, I struck up a conversation with their product development manager, Diane. "The pasta looks amazing," I said as I adjusted my lighting setup, "but the sauce is a bit generic. Have you considered something more authentic?" "We've been searching for the right sauce for months," Diane admitted. Everything either tastes mass-produced or is too expensive for our price point. An idea formed in my mind, dangerous but potentially perfect. I hesitated for only a moment. I might have a solution, I said carefully. A traditional family recipe that's absolutely incredible. It's not mine to share fully, but I could create something inspired by it, capturing the essence while making it my home. Diane was immediately interested. Could you develop a sample for us to try? I had watched Antonio's mother make the sauce dozens of times before she passed away last year. I'd observed the process, noted the ingredients, even helped chop herbs and vegetables on occasion. I didn't have the exact recipe, but I had a photographer's eye for detail and a decent palate. Over the next 2 weeks, I experimented in my kitchen, trying to recreate the magic of Nonna's ragu. My version wasn't identical. I deliberately made certain changes to respect the family's ownership of the original, but it captured the spirit of the sauce. Rich, complex, with that distinctive something that made people close their eyes when they tasted it. When I presented it to Diane, her reaction confirmed I created something special. This is exactly what we've been looking for, she said after tasting it. Would you be willing to license this recipe to us? We brand it as Eliza's rustic ragu or something similar. The offer was generous, a substantial upfront payment plus ongoing royalties. It would provide financial security while Marco and I were abroad, maybe even allow me to be more selective with photography clients. And most importantly, it wasn't actually Nonna's recipe. It was my interpretation, my creation. I accepted the offer without telling Marco or his family. I rationalized that it wasn't a betrayal since my sauce was different enough to be its own product. Besides, Antonio had made it clear that the Rossi family had no interest in retail ventures. I wasn't taking anything from them. I was creating something new that happened to be inspired by their tradition. The sauce launched 3 months later to unexpected success. Eliza's rustic ragu became the top-selling product in the grocery chain's new Italian line. Food bloggers wrote about it. A local magazine did a small feature on me as an up-and-coming food entrepreneur. And that's when everything fell apart. Sophia saw the magazine while getting her hair done. Within hours, the entire Rossi family knew. Marco called from Singapore, his voice tight with shock and anger. "How could you do this behind my back?" he demanded. My father is livid. "It's not Nonna's recipe," I protested. "I created my own version." "That's not the point. You knew this would hurt my family. You knew my father's feelings about the family sauce. Your father made his feelings clear about the family sauce. This isn't that sauce. This is my sauce." The distinction didn't matter to the Rossis. To them, I had stolen their heritage, their grandmother's legacy, and monetized it against their explicit wishes. Antonio was threatening legal action. Lucia had blocked my number. Even Maria, who had always been kind to me, was devastated by what she saw as a betrayal. The next Sunday, I went to the family dinner alone. It was the most uncomfortable meal of my life. Antonio wouldn't look at me. Sophia and Lucia sat as far from me as possible. Only Maria attempted conversation, though her eyes were sad. "I didn't steal your recipe," I said when I couldn't bear the silence any longer. "I created something new inspired by what I learned in this family." "You took our grandmother's legacy and sold it to strangers," Sophia replied coldly. "No, I created my own legacy when you refused to expand yours." Antonio finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You are not family. You will never understand what this means to us." Those words cut deeper than he knew. Ever since marrying Marco, I had tried to find my place in the Rossi family. I had learned their traditions, celebrated their holidays, even started learning Italian. But in their eyes, I would always be an outsider. I left the restaurant knowing something fundamental had broken. That night, Marco and I had the most difficult conversation of our marriage. "They're my family, Eliza," he said, his voice tinny over the video call. "I'm trapped in the middle of this, and it's tearing me apart." "I'm your family too," I reminded him. "And I didn't do anything wrong." I saw an opportunity they refused to consider, and I created something of my own. By using knowledge you gain from them. Knowledge freely shared in a family kitchen. I didn't steal a written recipe or corporate secrets. We went around in circles until exhaustion forced us to stop. Nothing was resolved. The chasm between us seemed to widen with each passing day. Marco was under tremendous pressure from his family to make things right, though nobody could define what that meant. Meanwhile, the sauce continued to gain popularity. The grocery chain wanted to expand distribution. A major food magazine requested an interview about my journey from photographer to food creator. The success felt hollow without Marco's support. But I wasn't willing to give it up either. This was my creation, my achievement. 3 months into our separation, with 3 months left before I was supposed to join Marco in Singapore, I received a formal letter from a lawyer representing Rossi's Italian bistro. They were claiming my sauce violated their trade secrets and demanding I cease production immediately. It was a weak legal argument. I genuinely hadn't copied their exact recipe, but fighting it would be expensive and emotionally draining. More importantly, it forced me to confront the real cost of what was happening. Was this sauce worth losing my marriage? Worth causing a permanent rift between Marco and his family? I called Marco that night, expecting another argument. Instead, I found him subdued and thoughtful. "I've been thinking about this situation from every angle," he said, "and I realized something important." "What's that?" "My grandmother was an innovator. Everyone talks about preserving her legacy, but they forget that she constantly experimented, adapted recipes from her village, created new dishes. The ragu itself was her adaptation of something traditional." I held my breath, afraid to interrupt this unexpected shift. "What you did," he continued, "was actually very much in her spirit. You took inspiration and created something new. My father talks about tradition, but he's frozen it in amber instead of letting it evolve." Tears pricked at my eyes. "That means a lot to me, Marco, but your family doesn't see it that way." "No, they don't," he agreed. "Not yet. But I have an idea that might change everything." Marco's plan was both simple and radical. Create a new sauce together that explicitly honored Nonna while being distinctly different from both her original recipe and my current product. We would develop it collaboratively with Antonio and Maria, giving them creative control while I contributed my marketing expertise. The profits would establish a culinary scholarship in Nonna's name. It was a beautiful vision, but I was skeptical the Rosses would even consider it. Marco asked me to trust him. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the Rossi's kitchen, not the restaurant kitchen, but the home kitchen where the family actually lived and ate. Marco had flown back from Singapore for this meeting. Antonio and Maria sat across from us, faces unreadable. "Before you say anything," Marco began, "I want you to taste something." He placed 4 small jars on the table, one containing Nonna's original sauce from the restaurant, one with my commercial product, and 2 unmarked jars. "These last 2 are new," he explained. "One is a recipe Eliza and I developed together over video calls this past week. The other is something I found in Nonna's recipe box that she labeled Ragu Nuovo, her experiment that she never served at the restaurant." Antonio's eyebrows rose slightly at this revelation. Maria nodded as if confirming a memory. "She was always tinkering," Maria said softly, "even in her final years." We tasted all 4 sauces in silence. The differences were subtle but distinct. Nonna's original was perfect in its traditional execution. My commercial version was brighter, with more herbs. The version Marco and I had created together somehow captured elements of both while introducing a deeper, more complex flavor profile. And Nonna's experiment, her new ragu, was the most surprising of all. Lighter, with unexpected notes of citrus and a hint of spice. She was trying something completely different, Antonio said, wonder creeping into his voice as he tasted his mother's experiment. "All these years and I never knew." "Because she knew you valued tradition above all else," Marco replied gently. "But she was an artist, Papa. Artists never stop creating." Antonio was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at me directly for the first time in months. "You should not have gone behind our backs," he said firmly. "That was wrong." I nodded, accepting the criticism. "But," he continued, "perhaps we have been too rigid. My mother, it seems, was not afraid of new ideas. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but it was an opening." Over the next few hours, we talked more honestly than ever before. About family legacy, about innovation versus tradition, about belonging and outsider status. The conversation was difficult but necessary. By evening, we had the outline of a plan. The grocery chain would continue selling Eliza's rustic ragu, with a percentage of profits going to the culinary scholarship. Meanwhile, the Rossi family would launch a premium line of restaurant sauces for retail, including both Nonna's original recipe, finally, and a new Rossi family reserve that Marco and I would develop with Antonio and Maria. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Sofia and Lucia remained cool toward me. Antonio still had moments of stubborn resistance to change. But it was progress. A year later, the Rossi retail line launched to critical acclaim. The jarred version of Nonna's original sauce won a specialty food award. The scholarship in her name had its first recipient, a young chef from the same Italian village where she had been born. Marco and I eventually returned from Singapore and bought a house halfway between our apartment and his parents' home. The physical distance seemed appropriate, close enough for regular family dinners, far enough to maintain our independence. One Sunday, as we all gathered around the table at Rossi's, Antonio raised his glass for a toast. To family, he said, looking around the table. His gaze lingered on me for a moment before adding, all of our family, and to my mother, who taught us that tradition is not what you preserve, it's what you nourish so it can grow. I felt Marco squeeze my hand under the table as we all clinked glasses. The sauce that had nearly torn us apart had ultimately forced us to create something better, a genuine family bond based on mutual respect rather than blind obedience to tradition. Sometimes the most important family recipe isn't about food at all. It's about finding the right balance of honoring the past while creating space for something new to flourish.